Welcome to this video tutorial on how to create a wintry scene in VRay for Rhino. In this video I'm going to be using this simple model set inside this landscape here to create a wintry scene using VRay as its main render engine. To do this we're going to first start by setting our lighting in our scene, and I'm going to do this by just going into VRay at the top here and opening up VRay's asset editor. You also want to make sure, just under your render settings, that your current render is also set to VRay, so it uses this as your default render engine when rendering this scene. Now to begin with, I've actually already set two materials for some bronze elements and for the walls of my structure. And if I open up my VRay frame buffer, which is this little window here in the asset editor, we can see a little preview of this view that we have. Now at the moment you can see I've got materials for my walls and for these metal pieces, but we've got no sky and also no ground material, which we're going to start to switch. Now to begin with, I'm going to start by setting up the background environment and sky. If I click on the texture option here, you'll see by default we have this environment texture, and this is currently lighting the scene. You can see it gives us this kind of grey light here, and actually I want a sort of blue sky for this particular image. So what we're going to do is I'm going to click on the new tab down here. We're going to go to textures, and then we're going to select the sky texture. I'm then going to right click and copy this sky. We're then going to go to the settings, find the environment tab here, which you can find just below the animation tab there, and under background you'll see it currently has a kind of slot, a texture added in there, which is marked by this blue square. Now to switch this out, I'm just going to right click and I'm going to click paste as instance, and that will paste in this new sky texture into that slot. Now in order to check that, I'm going to open up my frame buffer again, and we're going to just hit on this render preview just to have a look and see what that now looks like. And we'll give it a little bit of time to load up there. Now what you can see when this loads up, that it actually is really bright to start with. The reason for that is currently my display corrections aren't correcting any of the exposure of this image, so usually what I do is just scroll this down to a sort of minus 4.5 or something like that. Now if we go back to our asset editor, you can see we can turn on the custom orientation here, and we can start to tweak our sky and which angle the sky is coming from. You'll notice here that we can tweak that, but we're not actually getting any strong shadows on our object. The reason for that is I also need to turn on the VRay sun in order for the sun to work on this object as well. This can be found back in the asset editor under this lighting tab, and under the Rhino document sun I can turn it on just by clicking on this sunlight option. And there you can see I've now got light in my scene. Now all I'm going to do is just go back to my sky texture, and we're just going to play with the orientation of this until we've got a nice lighting kind of coming in on half my objects like so. I'm also going to make this relatively low in the sky, so we've got a kind of nice wintry kind of low light level coming in like so. Now we have a few things we can tweak with our sun as well, and actually if you're using VRay 7, which is the newest model, if we scroll down here we can actually turn on the clouds as well, and we can start to add some clouds to our scene. And I'm just going to move this tab over to the right so we can see it there. You can see here the density, I can add more or less clouds, but actually for this I don't want any big clouds, but I want lots of sort of these cirrus clouds in the sky there, just to give a nice kind of texture to that back sky. And I'm going to leave it like that for now. So now we've set up our sky, we're now going to begin to set up our snow texture, which is going to be the base of this sort of wintry scene here. Currently you can see my ground actually just has this kind of green texture on, and I'm going to replace this with a snowy texture to give us that sort of feel of snow. Now to do this we're going to go into our materials, and I'm going to create a brand new material, and we're just going to create a subsurface scattering material. This is going to allow us to create a snow-like material which has that sort of blue kind of subsurface to it, but also that sort of white solid surface on the top to make it feel quite realistic and quite like snow. So we're going to create that new material, and then we're going to apply that just on to my terrain layer there, and I'm just going apply to layer by right clicking on the material and applying it to the terrain. Now as you can see we've currently got this kind of yellowy undertone, which is not what I want for this particular material, so I'm going to change my diffuse colour to a white as well, and then we're going to change this subsurface colour to a sort of blue, and we want it quite a kind of icy light blue, not too dark. You want it quite close to white, but just a little bit of blue there to give us that blue tone. And then also for the scatter color, again, we're going to make that a nice tone of blue as well, somewhere like that. And here you can see in the little preview and in my kind of preview here, we're now getting that nice kind of bluey whitish snow there as well. Now currently my snow is very flat, it's got no kind of texture to it, so we're also going to add a bump map to give it a bit of texture. You'll find if we go down in our subsurface scattering material that we actually don't have a slot to apply a bump map to, but we can add one in if we go up to this Add Attribute tab, and we can click on Bump there to apply a bump to this. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pause the render for a second. We're just going to go online and we're going to find a nice bump map to use. Now I'm using this snow texture that can be found in Polyhaven, which is a free asset library for textures and 3D models, and I'll put a link to this particular texture in the description of this video. I'm going to just download this, and we're going to be using this kind of normal map that we can see here to apply a bump and a texture to the surface of our snow to make it feel like it's not just flat, it's got a little bit of texture to it. So once you download this, we're then going to go back to our VRay model, find that snow, find our bump again. Under the mode for the map, I'm going to switch this to a normal map, and then we're going to click on our material here. We're going to find our bitmap image. I'm going to look for that snow texture, and we're going to use this normal map here, like so. And we'll open that up, and this is going to give us that kind of snowy texture that's found on that particular one I've downloaded. Once we've done that, we're just going to go back, and that's now been applied. Now before we click our render preview, we also need to map this texture to the surface. To do that, I'm just going to minimize these particular windows here. We're going to select our terrain, we're going to go to Properties, and we're going to click on the Texture Mapping tab there. In here I'm going to use the box mapping because my terrain is 3D, and we're just going to draw out a little box which is going to represent 1 square of my texture. Now I'm not going to be too exact with this, I know it's something around this, and once we draw the box we're just going to hit enter to apply that, and that's around a sort of 3 by 3 by 3 meter box, which should be fine for this particular instance. You can always quickly check it just by going to the rendered viewport mode, and you can kind of see there we've got this sort of bumpiness on our surface there. So now let's open up those windows again just by going back to our asset editor, and then we'll preview our scene again, and there you can see we're now getting a bit of that texture on the snow, and you can kind of see it coming through there. Something else you may also want to play around with your snow material, it's a specular layer. I sometimes find actually putting it down to a bit more of a kind of grey tone looks a little bit more realistic. Also, if your bump isn't bumpy enough, you can always up it, doubling the amount to a 2, and that will increase that sort of bumpiness on the surface. I think for this particular one, I think actually on a 1 was slightly better for this particular material. But you can always go back, you can increase these sort of blue tones on the undertone of the material if you wanted a bit more blue, and play around with these if you need them to act a little bit more on your material. So that's our sort of base material there, and you can see that's working quite nicely to give us that snowy effect across our landscape. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to add some more details in, and I want to actually add some snow on the top of some of these walls and also on some of these sloped surfaces here to give the illusion that it's just snowed and you've got this kind of snow that's settled on some of these surfaces. Now to do this, I'm just going to pause my render again, and we're just going to minimize these pieces. I'm going to make a new layer in here, and we're just going to call this layer snow, like so, and let's just make it a nice light blue color so we can see it. Then all I'm going to do is I'm going to go to these objects here. We're just going to zoom selected on these so we can see it a bit more closely, and I'm going to use the copy tool here to create a copy of some of these walls. So let's just create a copy of this wall, and I'm just going to offset it ever so slightly from the top. I'm also then just going to push it just off to the left, just using the kind of gumball to do that. Now if it's kind of going too far, you can always just sort of nudge it back ever so slightly, and all I'm trying to achieve here is just by having it slightly offset from that kind of top of the wall, ever so slightly, like so. Now what we're going to do is we're going to just move that onto my new snow layer just by going to the Properties panel, changing the layer of this object to snow, as you can see there. And then we're going to go back to our view, just clicking on my named views here. I'm going to select that snow piece. We're going to open up our asset editor again, and I'm going to create a copy of this original snow material. So we'll just call this one snow, and then we're going to duplicate it, and we'll rename this snow wall, like so. Now I'm going to apply this to my new wall piece there, and before I render it, I'm also going to go back to this bump layer. I'm actually going to clear out this original bump I've put on because we don't want it super bumpy on the top of this wall, and I'm going to add a new one just as a bump map this time. We're going to go back to the texture slot, scroll down, and we're going to add this edges bump map. And what this will do is it's going to give a soft edge to this piece of snow, so it looks like a sort of freshly formed snow on the top of this wall that has a nice curvy edge to it. Now we can select the width of this edge under this little parameter box here, and it's set to the scene units, so I'm in millimeters, so I'm going to set it to around 30 millimeters, which would be about 3 centimeters. You'll see the preview will be black, don't worry too much about that there. And we'll just make sure that that's applied to that selection. Go back to our render again, and I'll just zoom in a little bit for this. And here you can see that it's now added that little bit of snow on top of the wall, and what it will also be doing is slightly curving the edge of that, just so it looks like a sort of soft layer of snow that's just landed on the top of that wall piece. Now we can also repeat this for some of our kind of diagonal pieces of snow as well. So all I'm going to do is just take some of these objects here. We've got these two surfaces. I'm going to do the same thing. We're just going to copy, this time I'm just going to copy them vertically. Let's just move them slightly upwards, like so, just so they're sat on top. And then I'm just going to push them inwards again, just so they're not kind of clipping any of the objects I already have, like so. Making sure you've got the topmost piece, we're then going to switch them to that snow layer again so we can see it, like so there. Now if you have something like this occurring where you've got a little bit of it coming through, we can always just push it wide just so we can't see it, and then we'll also do the same just for this one as well. Put this on our snow layer, and then going back to our asset editor, we can apply this directly to that layer. So we're just going to go apply to layer and apply it to the snow. Now what will happen if we then open up our VRay frame buffer again and hit on that render tab, making sure we go back to our view, like so. You'll see now that some of these objects will now have a nice kind of snowy surface on them, and you can go around and apply this to lots of different objects to just give that little bit of extra level of detail where it looks like snow has just fallen, and all we're doing is just copying the object and just offsetting it slightly and overlaying it on top of the existing piece to give the illusion that we've got that kind of snowy layer on top of it. So now we've got our sort of base snow, and we've got some of the details that are forming over the tops of these objects. Another layer of detail we can add is also mounds of snow that might be mounted up against some of these walls. Now to do this, I usually like to use sub-D surfaces to create little terrains that actually mount snow up against this wall. To do this, I'm going to just quickly go to the top view here. We're going to go to sub-D tools, and I'm going to make a brand new sub-D plane here, and we're just going to draw it kind of roughly over the top of some of these walls, like so. I'm then going to select that plane, and I'm going to use that subdivide panel that can be found here just to divide it into a few divisions. You don't want too many because it gets very hard to work with, so I'm going to keep it like this for now. Once I've done that, we're going to go back to our perspective view. We're just going to move it upwards so we can see it, and we're going to select that surface and type in edit points on, like so. This will turn on lots of these little points that we can use to manipulate the terrain. Now before I do this, we also want to click on this soft transform tool. Now by default it won't be enabled, so you want to make sure you click on this enable button and set it to yes, and you also want to set the radius usually to something quite large at first depending on the scale of your plane. I'm going to set it to 8,000, which is 8 meters, and we're going to just start by kind of just sculpting it into position. Now once you've set those points, remember to hit enter just to close that, and then we can pick a point on our surface. I'm going to start with this edge, and we can start to manipulate it, pulling it up or down into position. So let's just pull this one right down into the ground, like so. We're going to pull some of these down as well, Usually this is easier to do on a ghosted view, so you can actually see the points below the surface. Pull some of these up. Again, pull some of these ones up. We'll pull some of these ones down. And we're just wanting to create these sort of mounds of snow that look like the snow has kind of pushed up against these walls. Now you might need to sort of stretch and pull the terrain over, so I'm just going to do that in this case and for this one. You might also find that the radius you're working with is too big, so if you need to lower that down, we can go back to that soft transform. Let's put this down to a 3000 radius this time, so it's slightly smaller, and that means we can work with a little bit more detail. And we'll pull it down now. And you'll see here it's just a case of just pushing and pulling this surface up and down to create these mounds. So at this point I'm going to fast forward this video while I push and pull these pieces to create these mounds against the wall. Once you're happy with those pieces, we can then deselect them just to turn the points off, and then again we're just going to select that surface and apply our material to it. It might be if you've already applied it to the layer, it will already be on there, otherwise you just need to go apply to selection just to apply it on, like so. And there we've got our nice snow that's kind of mounding up against that edge. If we then turn back on our frame buffer and re-render that, you can see here that added little bit of detail just makes it feel like the whole building's been kind of encased in this snowfall that's sort of occurred and then mounded up against the side of this object. And you can add lots of that detail in across the scene to really build up that complexity and give your scene some life. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add some extra objects into the scene to build up this kind of elements and also add a little bit more detail to our view. To do this, I'm going to be using a mixture of VRay's built-in kind of asset management system, which can be found on this left-hand tab here, and we can browse it in this kind of Cosmos library, so we can download trees and plants and add them to the scene. So, and I'm also going to be using some I'm finding from Polyhaven as well. We're going to be using this kind of rocky landscape, which I'll put a link into in the description. We're going to start with these rocks. I'm just going to download this asset. I'm going to keep it at 1K because we don't want it too high resolution. And once downloaded, I'm going to go back in my scene. We'll just pause our render for now. And we're just going to go File, Import, and we're going to import that rock material in, like so. And hit OK there. If it asks you to rescale, just hit yes, because it will then reset that object to whatever the scale of your scene is. Once that's in, I'm just going to zoom selected to locate that object, which is usually at the 00 point of your file. And then we're going to rotate it around so we can accurately see it. Now usually this is easiest done in the rendered view, so we can actually see which way up the object is. You might find that you get a few of these in here, and the reason for this is actually all of them come in a different level of detail, which means the kind of number of polygons in the scene will be different. LOD 0 is the highest number, down to LOD 3, which is the smallest there. So depending on the resolution you need for your scene, you might want to choose a different resolution. I'm just going to delete all of these and I'm going to work with this LOD1 object here. Now once we have it, I want to move it in front of my camera to where I can see that object, and we're just going to go back to our view here. Let's put it back on a kind of shaded view so we can see it, and we're going to move these rocks a little bit closer to the camera, like so. I also want to, and I'm just going to make sure I zoom selected, so we're zooming on it, to make sure these are kind of half submerged in the ground, as you can see here, and we might need to rotate them around a little bit to get a nice angle of these, and then we're just going to push and pull them out from the path, like so. Then we're going to go back to our view so we can see it. Now sometimes this takes a little bit of wiggling to get a nice angle, but once we're happy, I'm then going to open back up my frame buffer, and we're just going to do a quick render preview just to see what that looks like. And there you can see we've got those rocks which are kind of half submerged in the ground. Now what you'll find is sometimes when you bring this material in, they might be very shiny. It's almost that it's kind of set the material, but they're quite shiny and they don't really look very realistic. What I usually like to do is just when you bring in any objects, especially from outward sources, is to make a new material for them. So I'm just going to make a brand new material, just make a generic material there. we're just going to select my rocks and apply to selection. With this as well, let's just make a new layer for these rocks just so they don't accidentally get that sort of snow layer. We might want to just make it in my 3D file here. We'll call this rocks. And then under my properties, let's just switch that to the rocks layer, like so, and we can see that by the black rock that we can see there. So that's now on that rocks layer, and we're just going to set that as our default layer, like so. So now with that set, we're going to go back to VRay. Under our new material, let's just call this rock. We're then going to go to the diffuse. Under the color, we're going to select bitmap, and we can find in that kind of rock model that we downloaded, you'll see there's a texture slot, and we can find that kind of rock texture in there, which we're going to use. And we'll just open that up like so. Also with this, I usually don't set a reflection for the rocks because you don't actually want it very shiny, so I'm just going to leave that blank. You might want to play around with the bump, but actually usually just a diffuse is quite good for these because they've got quite a detailed map on them already, and you'll see that will just take off the shininess there. If you feel like it is lacking a little bit of that shininess, you can always add it. You'll find in that folder from the models we got there under textures, you've got this kind of glossiness one, or this normal map, and this roughness map here. Roughness we can actually use to kind of set the reflective value of the object, but it does it in a slightly different way than reflection does. Roughness is essentially the kind of inverse effectively of that kind of glossiness and reflection value put together. So you can always drop that map in and invert it if you want to as well. Something I usually do if I just want a quick fix is just paste the kind of diffuse map into the roughness map, and it just gives you a little bit of values to work with there. There you can see it's just going to take the edge off this. It's going to be slightly shiny, but not much. It's just a very, very subtle kind of texture we're adding in. So once we've got that rock texture on, I also then want to add a snowy texture to this because we've got this nice snow and these rocks sort of stick out a little bit of this surface now. So we're going to apply our snow texture also on the surface of this rock. To do this, we're going to use very much the same technique that we use to add the snow on our other objects. We're going to just make a copy of our rocks, and then we're going to sort of slightly offset it to create the snow. So all I'm going to do is I'll click that copy option, like so. We're first going to start just by moving it vertically, and we're just going to move it ever so slightly upwards, like that. Now to see this a bit more clearly, I'm going to select this new copy, and we're going to move it to that snow layer, like so. Then I just want to shift it slightly off, and you can either shift it to the left or to the right depending on where you want your snow build up to be. Now if I'm kind of matching my snow mounds here, we actually want to push it slightly to the right, so I'm just going to push it there, and what you can see happening here, if we zoom selected on this, is we're getting our snow that's just kind of feels like it's kind of collecting on the right side of this rock, and it's a really nice technique this, where you're just offsetting that mesh, but because of the detail of the mesh it looks like the snow is basically just accumulated on one side. Then all we need to do is just take our new object there and make sure we've applied that other snow surface to it, and I'm just going to use this basic snow texture for that. We're going to go back to our named view there, and then we're going to re-render that out to have a look at it. And there you can see we've now got that nice snow build up on the side of our surface. Now if you feel like it's too much, we can always tweak that just by kind of moving it around and offsetting or kind of pushing back and forward the placement of that object. And sometimes it takes a little bit of moving just till you get the right amount of snow build up there versus the actual object itself. But it's a nice technique that just allows this sort of effect where it feels like you've got this snow accumulation happening on the surface of those geometries, like so. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video for a second, and I'm just going to copy this and repeat this around the file to add a bit more detail of rocks in amongst this landscape and just to build up that complexity. You can now see that I've added a few rocks and snowy rocks kind of around the scene to build up that detail, and you can always add more varieties of these, rotate them, twist them, and build that scene up to add more complexity. Now, as a kind of final asset I'm going to add in, I'm also going to add in some snowy trees just to add into the background of this landscape and also give us some nice shadows in this scene as well. To do this, I'm going to go back to my VRay asset editor, and we're going to use the Cosmos library to find some snowy trees. Now, you don't need to find them here, you can find some online and also create your own, but they do have a good kind of selection of different assets that we can work with. Now, if we just go into kind of VRay here, and we're going to just drop down and look at the 3D models, and then under vegetation and trees, like so. We can scroll down and you can see that a lot of trees have different varieties in the spring or summer. There are not many winter trees on offer, but if you scroll down you can find some winter pines and also some winter fir trees as well that we can start to use. Now you see there's lots of sort of summer varieties, and then we get these kind of very leafless sort of snowy trees that we can use here as well. See here we've got some sort of cherry trees. We've got a nice kind of wintry birch there in the snow, and then we've got these kind of pines and spruces. Now I'm going to use this pine tree for my particular file, and we're just going to import it just by clicking that import button there to drop it in the scene, and we'll just copy it in like so. Once you've done that, I'm just going to hit the escape button to go back here, and we'll just minimize these down for now. Now with this, I want a few of these sort of scattered across my landscape, but I also want them casting a nice shadow on here. So I'm just going to start just by moving it off screen slightly. We're just going to put it over there for now because I've got my sun coming in from this side, so it casts a nice shadow. Now I want to create a scatter group of these so it scatters the tree over my terrain like so. So to do that, I'm going to click on the VRay panel. We're going to go to Tools and Objects here, and we're going to go and click on the Convert to Scatter Host option there. With that, we're going to select the object which we want to make a scatter host, which is my terrain, and we're going to hit enter there to create a scatter host on that terrain. And what this means is I can then add my tree and scatter it across this surface. Now to do that, we're going to go to VRay Asset Editor again. This time we're going to go to our objects, and under geometries you see we've got this scatter option. In here I can click add guests, and I'm going to add the tree and hit enter there. And what you can see if we just move that window down is we've now got thousands and thousands of those trees on my file. Now I don't want this many, so I'm just going to minimize that so we can see what we're working with. And under that scatter, we're going to scroll down and start to play around with some of these. So we want to make sure under my instances count, I've actually probably only need 100 there. We keep that random distribution on, so we've got a random distribution of these, but I'm going to go down to the transform option. Because you can also see that because I've got such a sloped landscape, when they hit a slope they actually go at a diagonal because they're following that terrain. I want them to all stand upright as trees usually do. So we're going to go down to this rotation and we're going to click on this normal alignment, and we're just going to set it to 1, and this will straighten all the trees up there. Now we've done that, we're also going to change the scale of these. Now at the moment the scale will be kind of uniformly scaling them between this amount, a scale of 1 to 1, so they're going to stay all at the same size. I want that to be a bit smaller, so I'm going to do a 0.5 to a 0.8 scale, so they're all a little bit smaller there. We might need to fine tune that a bit more as we go, but that should be good for now. And once we've set that, we're going to go back to our camera, and then we're going to do a test render of that to see how that's looking there. And all it's going to do is just load that up. As you can see, we've now got our trees kind of scattered nicely across our landscape. Now that's working pretty well, but you might always want to add a few more in. So often I'll just keep this open. We could go back to our instances. Maybe you want sort of 50 more trees, slightly denser, add a few more there. I'm going to actually keep it quite low because I don't want too many in the scene. And you also might want to play around with the scale. They might want to be a bit bigger, so I'm going to up that to a 1, and that will just increase the size. So you can always go back, play around with some of these features just to tweak the size and scaling of those trees. You can see that tree I added on the right hand side is also casting a nice shadow on the foreground there, just to sort of add a bit more detail to the foreground of my scene. Now I'm quite happy where this has ended up, but you could also add in a few more plants if you wanted to here, just to add to the detail, or people in the scene as well. but I think for this particular tutorial we're going to finish up here and we're going to render this out, and as a final touch we're going to add some sort of snowfall to this scene as well. Now in order to render this, I'm just going to stop my render there first, and we're going to go to the settings, and then we're going to go to our render output, and I want this at a relatively high resolution, so we're going to render this at around 2000 or 3000 pixels depending on what you want. Usually if I'm doing a sort of medium image, I do it anywhere between 2,000 or 3,000 pixels in this size. Let's go 2.5 just to give us some more to work with there. Also what we want to do is we might want to set the time limit of this. We're going to up the quality to high there, and we're going to set the time limit on here, and then we'll just let it render out for sort of 15 minutes or an hour. Now this all depends on your computer and the kind of level of quality you want your output to be, especially with things like snow. It can actually look quite good when it's a bit noisy like this. It makes it look nice and sparkly, but you might want to limit that, in which case you'll need a kind of longer time. So the longer you do it, the less noise you're going to get in your image there. Before we render it, we're also going to set up a few render elements that are going to help us when we edit this. To do that, I'm just going to click on this render elements tab. We're going to select the material random color, which is really useful, and then just clicking on the plus here, we're also going to set up that raw light render element, which is also a useful one to have. And if you want any others, you can also set them here. Sometimes reflection and specular are quite useful, especially when you're working with snow there, so we'll set that up. You might also want some more lighting options, which we can use to then set them later. And also the Z depth can be quite useful, which sets a sort of depth map in the scene. Now these numbers are always set on your units, and I'm in millimeters, so 500 millimeters isn't going to get me very far. So I'm going to actually set it to 50,000, which is more like 50 meters, which will give us a good depth in our scene. Let's make it a bit higher actually, like so. So once you're happy with those, we're then going to render that out just by clicking that render button there. And this might take a bit of time, so I'm going to pause the video as this renders, and then we're going to save our image out that we're then going to add in our kind of post-production effects like our snowfall to finish up this scene. Once our image is rendered out, we're then going to save out all of these image files. Now before we do this, you'll notice that I've got my exposure setting on here, and I've got it as a kind of -4, but it says display only down here, which means if I save it, it's going to go back to its kind of original 0 exposure, and it's going to be a little bit bright. So in order to correct that, we're going to set this back to 0 here, and under our layers we're going to click plus, and we're going to apply an exposure layer correction there. Now with this one, we're going to lower down to a -4.5 again, or whatever exposure we sort of need, and then we're going to save it after this point, like so. We're going to save it as a JPEG, and I'm going to call it winter scene, and hit save. And that will save out both the image and then all of the image passes as well, which we can find here. We're going to have the raw light, we're going to have the material random color as well, also the Z depth, so they'll all be saved out as separate image channels. Now we have all of our images saved out, as we can see here. We're now going to bring these into Photoshop to do our kind of last edits to our image. To do this, we're going to open up Photoshop and begin by going to the File tab, go to Scripts, and click on the Load Files into Stack option. This will allow us to select all of our render elements, which we can find here, and it will simultaneously bring them into a single Photoshop file for us to work in. So we're just going to load this up, and you can see here we've got all of those layers that are stacking nicely into our layers panel in Photoshop. Now once these are brought in, I want to take my main kind of image and I'm just going to move it to the top there, and I'm just going to select these other render elements, and we're just going to call these elements, and we'll just drop them in a folder at the bottom there. So we've got those kind of tucked away there. Now I'm going to do a few quick edits to this just to kind of bring the picture to life and just tweak the colours slightly to make it feel like a more wintry scene. The first of these is I'm just going to take my raw light, I'm going to hold the Alt key on my keyboard and then click and drag that layer to copy it upwards on top of my image, and I'm going to put it on a soft light mode and then just reduce it down. And all this is going to do, as you can see here, is it just increases the intensity of those shadows. Now, depending on how you want your kind of lighting to be perceived in your file, you might want to have that on quite strong, or you might want to have it quite dim, but you can play around with that to basically increase the brighter areas and also the darker areas in the image and add a little bit more contrast to the whole scene. The second of these is we can also take this specular layer, hold down the Alt key again, drag it up, drop it on top, and these are all our kind of specular highlights. These look quite good on a screen blending mode, as you can kind of see here, but again, it's always quite strong when you put it on, so you usually want to reduce it down to a sort of low percentage on that fill percentage, just so it's kind of picking up some of those lighting qualities, as we can kind of see there. The last one I'm going to use is the Z depth. Again, we're going to hold the Alt key and drag it up, and here you can see we get a really nice depth map of our scene where it's black in the background and white in the foreground. Now I'm going to use this to create a kind of fog in the image, and actually to do that we need to invert this layer. We can either do that by going up to Image, Adjustments and Invert here, or you can hit Control I on your keyboard to flip that around, and as you can see we're getting this nice kind of mist effect that's going on. From this I'm going to just take that layer, switch the blending mode to a screen, and you can see it adds a nice fog to the image, and then we're just going to reduce that down just to give us a kind of nice fog in this background. A couple of last tweaks we're going to do is I'm going to go on to my adjustment layers down here. We're going to go to the color lookup adjustment layer, and in these we're going to use the crisp winter layer just to add a kind of coolness to the image. Again, I'm going to reduce that right down so it's just on a little bit, because usually it gets quite intense, it gets a bit too blue for my liking, and I'm going to put it on around a 20, something like that there. As a last thing I want to do, I'm just going to select the whole image, and we're going to use the copy merge tool, which is found here, the Shift Control C, to copy all of these layers, and then we're going to edit and paste them back on to essentially create a copy of all of these layers that have added up to our image. Once we've done this, we can actually then start to use filters on this, and we're just going to finish up by using the camera raw filter for some last tweaks and effects. In here I can play around with the contrast of the image, I can bring up the highlights, I can lower that temperature down if we want it a bit cooler, up the vibrance sometimes, and just drop that saturation slightly. This clarity is also quite nice, it's a good way of adding a bit of contrast, and the texture, either make it more textured or you can make it kind of more fuzzy there, and maybe add a little bit of a vignette to it as well. And you can see there it's just kind of bringing up and slightly kind of adding a little bit of contrast and making the image a little bit sharper there as well. Now we've got our base layer. As a final tweak to this, I want to add some snowfall. Now you can do this as a static snowfall in Photoshop, or we can do it in AfterEffects and animate it, and I'm going to show both methods. For the static method, we're just going to take our image here, I'm going to make a new layer, we're going to fill it black, then I'm going to go to Filter, Noise, and Add Noise here. Make sure it's around a kind of 40-50% on a monochromatic noise, and then we're going to hit the Control T to transform it on our keyboard, and we're going to transform it by around 500% to scale it up like so. Might need to be a bit more than that depending on the scale of your image, but that should probably work for this. In fact, maybe I'll do it a little bit more. Let's just do it another 50 like so, because this is essentially going to determine the scale of your kind of snow. Once you've got that, we're going to change it from a normal to a screen blending mode, as you can see here, and then we're going to add a levels adjustment layer on top of that layer, and if you hold the Alt key in between these, we can clip the levels so it just affects that snow layer below. We'll just call this snow for now. Once you've done that, you can click on the levels, and if we just play around with this sort of black area here, you see we can pull it in, essentially reducing the amount of snow we have just using that levels, and that will kind of reduce the amount of snowfall we're getting or add more in. And that's essentially how you can add a kind of static snowfall onto the top of the image, and we can always play around with the opacity of that if you don't want it as strong, or you can use a mask to kind of rub bits out. Now if we actually want to animate this, we can also do that in AfterEffects. To do that first, I'm essentially going to take off that layer, and I'm just going to save out this as a JPEG. Then we're going to open it up in our AfterEffects file. with After Effects open, we're going to click on the New Composition from Footage option and select our single image and bring it into our file. From here we're going to make sure that layer is selected at the bottom there, and then we're going to go to the Effects tab, go down to the Simulation and select the CC Snowfall option. Usually, depending on the size of your image, if you've rendered it quite large, we might need to up the size of that snow. So we're just going to start by upping it to around 15 there so we can see it, and also upping the opacity so we can see it fall a bit more. And you can hit the spacebar on your keyboard there to play that snowfall just to see how it's playing back. Now there's also lots of other parameters we can play around with, like the wind and the speed of the snow, and also the depth of it in the scene. So we can adjust each of these parameters to essentially get the best looking snowfall for our image. And this will give us this kind of nice sort of falling snow effect that we can then add on top of our image and really kind of bring the whole piece together to add that sort of layer of atmosphere. Now, as you can see, I've got quite a long time on my timeline here, so before you render it out, we usually want to reduce the time to whatever you kind of need. I'm doing mine at around 30 seconds here, so it's got 30 seconds of snowfall. Then from there, we're just going to go up to the composition, click the Add to Adobe Media Encoder button, and this will then export it out as a desired file choice. Now, the Adobe Media Encoder is essentially a separate program that we can then render out our video from, and here we can set the format. We can also set the kind of resolution quality of that video, and usually I just do it as an H.264 format, and we match the resolution of our file. You also want to give it a location to save and also a name from there, and once you're ready you can just hit that play button and then that will start to render the video out. So as that renders out, we're just going to wait for that to go, and it usually doesn't take too long depending on the size of your video. And as you can see, the final image you get is your kind of snowfall render with your textures done in VRay, your edits done in Photoshop, and then this effect also done in After Effects as a final touch. I hope you enjoyed this video on how to create a wintry scene in VRay, and if you want to watch any other videos on rendering, visualization in VRay or modeling in Rhino, then please do check out the videos on the channel. Thanks for watching.